Good day, dear students. Today we are going to start with our lecture number 15 of psycholinguistics, and today we are going to study a little bit in detail about the remaining aspects of psycholinguistics. So, language loss. Now, first of all, we are going to see the factor of language loss. Language loss in the normal elderly speakers of 70% and 80% with no apparent brain damage varies considerably between individuals. So there is often a decline in the receptive skills. Now, people who are, they grow older, they start losing the ability to speak. By that time, now some of it is caused because of brain damage. Some of it is caused for different various reasons. So out of 80% that have no apparent brain damage, even then they have a considerable loss of language and their skills. So there is often a decline in the receptive skills. Receptive skills are those that when we are receiving the skills for language, and our power to distinguish between different sentences, our vocabulary, how we produce the language. So sentence length does not appear to be a major obstacle, but sentence complexity does. So it's not the length of the sentence, it's not how long the sentence is, but how complex the sentence would be, or how difficult it would be to understand, to comprehend. The main reason would appear to be increased difficulty in coordinating syntactic and semantic processing. So how we structure the language and how we try to understand the meaning of the language. That would appear to be, they would find it difficult. They grow older, they find it difficult in coordinating how to, the meaning and the structure of the sentences. Now, this is especially noticeable when older people are called upon to process complex syntactic structures, such as subordinate clauses. So, if they are called on to deal with a complex syntactic structure of a sentence, at that point they might have some difficulty. Now, their recall of connective links between sentences may also be less precise than that of younger subjects. So sometimes connecting the links between sentences may also be a little less precise or less obvious to the people than what a younger person would achieve. So the variation between individuals may reflect the fact that some are more successful than others in developing strategies to compensate for the reduction of syntactic information. So a variation between the individuals, like everybody is different, so everybody has a little bit of variation in the way they would reflect the fact that some would be successful in it, in developing the strategies to compensate for the reduction in the structure information, and some would not have difficulty with it. Now, they often appear to fall back upon context, using sentence meaning and word knowledge to supplement their understanding. So sometimes they would fall back upon context. They would use their world knowledge instead of trying to make a sentence meaningful. If they don't understand something, then they'll try to, instead of their memory, falling back on their memory and the rules that they know, they would maybe fall towards their knowledge because they've gained a lot of knowledge according to their age. So this reliance on semantics leads to difficulty in dealing with sentences which are ambiguous in meaning. So sometimes if they do completely rely on trying to understand things through their world knowledge, then it does create some difficulty sometimes. Now, many aspects of higher level comprehension appear unimpaired. So when we discuss that some of the aspects of higher level comprehension, higher level understanding of a language may seem unimpaired. So, for example, the ability to make inferences, to integrate incoming knowledge into a mental representation, and to bring world knowledge to bear. So sometimes, for example, the ability to make inferences would count also trying to make an inference or referencing something to it or integrating something, incoming whatever knowledge they're gaining into a mental representation and to bring word knowledge to bear, like to bring it to their view. Now, but there may be a reduction in the number of factors which the older person's working memory can handle. So sometimes there might be a reduction in it, in the number of factors which the older person's memory can't handle. They can't, their working memory gets a little weak, and their permanent memory also goes weak. But at that time, then some things get reduced. They can't retrieve material so easily or so quickly as a younger person can. And they remember things in bits and parts, skipping most of the areas. So that would create difficulty for them to comprehend a language or produce it. Now, hence occasional difficulty in retaining the information necessary for handling pronoun reference or negative sentences. So that leads to their difficulty sometimes in retaining necessary related to grammar or negative pronoun references or negative sentences, and mostly everything related to grammar. Now, older people find it easier to recall sentences where the chronological order is the order of mention. So after locking the door, she turned off the lights. This is a very good example of it. So older people might find it easier to recall these sentences where the chronological order, where it is given in a sequence, in an order. A sentence is in a sequence, like first they locked the door, then turned the lights off. So that would be maybe easier for them to mention it or remember it than those where it is the reverse. Before locking the door, she turned off the lights. That might be a little difficult for them to comprehend. But the first part, if they have it in chronological order, then it's easier for them to understand and memorize it. So after locking the door, she turned off the lights. Instead of before locking the door, she turned off the lights. So far as the production of speech is concerned, elderly speakers tend to produce more unfinished sentences than do younger ones, and appear to need more time to assemble their utterances. So elderly people would have more difficulty in producing speech or producing unfinished sentences than a younger subject would. And they would appear to need more time to assemble their utterances, means that they need more time before they can convert their thoughts into speech. So one suggestion is that there is a general decline in a speaker's ability to self-monitor. Sometimes you can say that there may be having a general decline in it, which causes problems with the production and the understanding, the comprehension. So we can consider that as a general decline, that they are having difficulty producing the language or understanding the language or making people understand what they want to say. You can check this out with your grandparents. Maybe you might notice it, that they might have difficulty putting their thoughts immediately into words, considering if you would compare them with the younger generation. So this may be attributable, again, to changes in working memory, which reduce the ability to perform multiple tasks. So sometimes we can maybe say that this is the cause would be that there are changes in the working memory, and that's why their ability is reduced or made less to perform these multiple tasks of trying to produce and comprehend at the same time. Now, the classic syndrome reported by the elderly is difficulty in finding words. So that means like remembering the vocabulary, or they're thinking about something, but the way they would express it, maybe they would have difficulty finding the words to express themselves. Now, they report more frequent tip of the tongue experiences than do younger speakers. So they would more frequently, it would be easier for them that whatever comes to their mind immediately, they'll just on the tip of the tongue, any foreign bol dete. Then younger speakers might think before they produce the speech. So however, they have a high success rate in finally locating the desired word, and there is no evidence that items are actually lost from the lexicon. So even though that they're having difficulty producing it, there is no actual experiment that proves that they've lost those words from their memory, from their permanent memory, or from the storage in their brain. But the thing is, it's not a loss of vocabulary that is causing this, but how to process it. Like retrieving it would be the process that they are having difficulty with. Even though they might have that word still stored in their memory, it's just difficult for them to retrieve it. Now, the chief change seems to be that the process of retrieving lexical items becomes slower, just like I was telling you right now, as does the process of making associative links between items. So not only retrieving the vocabulary or the lexical items is difficult for them, but also the process of making associative links between items, like linking the two things together, or maybe running it as on a parallel. That would be maybe difficult for them. So the results are seen in unfinished sentences and a higher incidence of general terms, flower for rose. Instead of saying that I like roses, they would just simply say I like flowers, or walk for march. Instead of I saw a march on the television, so instead of saying that I saw a walk on the television. So they'd replace words sometimes for simpler words. So instead of being precise about something, they would replace it with simpler things to explain themselves. Now, there has been interest in a theory, the regression hypothesis, that language loss may replicate in reverse the order of acquisition by infants. So sometimes there is a theory that they call the regression hypothesis, and that theory sort of states that the language loss may be a replicate, maybe a duplicate, or same action as in reverse. When like a child is gaining the powers to acquire a language, the same way it's working in reverse, that when you're a child, you're an infant, you start acquiring language from your social surroundings and from different methods of repetition or storing in your memory. Same action would work in reverse for the elderly, that by the time they keep on getting older, they keep on losing the language, or losing the ability of acquiring language or producing language. So the hypothesis has not been demonstrated yet, though certain linguistic concepts involving space, quantity, temporal relations, and subordination do appear to cause problems for some elderly speakers and listeners. So there is no evidence of a systematic pattern of loss. So at the moment, they say that certain linguistic concepts would be involving space, the quantity, the temporal relationship, and subordinate to appear to cause problems, that these things maybe are a cause for the problem for some elderly speakers and listeners. But there is still no evidence of a systematic pattern that they are losing their language or losing their ability of language. Now, when we study psycholinguistics, once again, we need to make it clear that it's all about how our thoughts and how our brain processes language. So if there is brain damage, then that does affect our ability to speak or to listen. So agnosia Agnosia is a condition sometimes caused by brain damage where a patient receives a signal but cannot recognize or classify it. So maybe they do receive a signal of a certain speech pattern. They can see a written form, or be it in speech, or if they're listening to it, but they can't recognize it. They just can't click to it. They might see a familiar object but be unable to say what it is. So sometimes it causes speech impediment. It's in which a part of the brain gets damaged, and that part that gets damaged is related to our speech abilities or to our linguistic abilities. Now, they might see something similar in that, but still they can't explain it or describe it. So visual agnosia in reading and auditory agnosia in listening result in an inability to perceive that two identical words represent the same word. So visual agnosia in reading and auditory agnosia, that would be in visual agnosia, that when we are reading, they might not comprehend a certain part of the context that they're reading. Auditory agnosia, when they're listening to something, maybe that results in they can't understand what exactly is being said. So to perceive the two identical word forms represent the same word, even though then it results in the inability of it. So agrammatism. Now if we move on to agrammatism. Now what is agrammatism? It's speech production in which many function words and inflectional endings are omitted. They're removed from it. It's a way of speech production in which many of the function words and inflectional endings are taken out of it. One possible symptom of the syndrome known as Broca's aphasia. Now that once again is another symptom in which there is speech impediment. Now early studies of agrammatism associated with damage to motor areas of the brain, which prevented sufferers from assembling syntactic structures. So once again, agrammatism is brain disease. And in this brain disease, what gets affected is the motor areas of the brain. That means that the areas that are producing the nerves and producing the signals for language, producing the motor skills would be like our things that we physically perform. Like if our brain would stop reacting, then we cannot move our hands or our fingers until we receive a signal from our brain. Now, I think in my head that I want to raise my arm, but until my brain will function properly and that thought would be transformed into a signal going towards my hand in my nerve reflexes, I won't be able to raise my hand. That happens with people who suffer from जैसे फॉलेज के मरीज हैं, उनका माइंड में भी वर्क कर रहा होता है, माइंड उनका सिग्नल भेज रहा है, ब्रेन उनका सिग्नल भेज रहा है कि टू मूव देयर हैंड, बट फिजिकली वो सिग्नल थ्रू नहीं हो रहा एंड दे कैंट पॉसिबली रेज देयर हैंड. So sometimes that attack is on one side of the body in which the nerves or the signals, the motor skills of one side of the brain get dead. So, however, it was discovered that many Broca's aphasics had problems in understanding function words as well as in using them. So, in this brain problem, which they called the Broca's aphasia, many people not only had difficulty in understanding how a word functions, but also how to use that word. So a theory developed that there may be separate stores for closed class items, those with a grammatical function, and lexical items, those where meaning has to be accessed. So a theory was developed that maybe there are separate stores in our brain where we can store the language, and sometimes it's closed for class items, and those with a grammatical function or something that relates with how we retrieve grammatical rules from our mind, and lexical items, those where meaning has to be accessed, where we need to know the words and then differentiate the meaning between them. Agrammatism may derive, in part at least, from difficulty in accessing the former. So agrammatism might be that it is having a difficulty in functioning grammatically or by retrieving lexical items. So ambiguity lexical. Now, in your lexical ambiguity at word level, as represented in a sentence such as tick the right box. So ambiguity, we can say that if, like for example, you've been said tick the right box, put a tick in it. So early experiments discovered that subjects' reactions were slower immediately after reading an ambiguous word. So sometimes they reacted slowly. This suggested that the processing of ambiguous words demands additional attentional resources because two senses of the word are activated rather than just one. So maybe it's because two senses are activated. That's the reason why they are having difficulty in processing such words. An important question is what happens when a potentially ambiguous word is disambiguated by the context in which it appears. So maybe there is an ambiguous word, but it's disambiguated. That means that it's made it more easier by the context in which it appears. Maybe a word is difficult, but the sentence in which that word appears, most of the time I always tell my students that if you're having difficulty trying to understand a word in English language and you don't know the meaning of it, you should always look at the words in that sentence coming before that word or after that. And that itself, the sentence itself in which the word is used, can always help you try to understand the meaning of that word. Even though if you don't have knowledge and you don't have the access, let's say, to a dictionary, then you can immediately, like, you can try to understand the word through the sentence. So one view is that the context influences the processing of the word so that we only access the appropriate sense. That could be one. The other, which has rather more evidence to support it, is that we cannot help but activate both senses. Sometimes it just naturally happens. Like we can't help it. It just gets activated. So a much quoted experiment by Swiney in 1979 indicated that hearing the word bug triggered associations with both possible meanings, insect and spy gadget. So a bug is a word. Now it's one word, pronounced the same way, written the same way, but it has two different meanings. So if we have it stored in our lexical items, then immediately it would be triggered with associating with both of the meanings. So how would we differentiate which one we are talking about? There's a bug in the room. If I say that sentence, how are you going to know if I'm talking about an insect or a spy gadget? A spy gadget would be, bug would be when you're spying on somebody, you put a listening object in the telephone. You must have seen it in many detective movies also. They put it in the telephones or in around the rooms to try to find out what the people are talking about in that room, or put spy cameras. So that would be a bug. So how would you tell if I just say the sentence that there is a bug in the room? Now, if you can't tell the meaning from just that, then look at the sentences that are coming before that or after it. So you'll have to see the whole context of the conversation. to understand. So if I would say that there's a bug in the room and I had experts come to remove it, and I felt that it was placed in my telephone, now that immediately indicates that it was about a spy gadget, because you can't put an insect in a telephone. So that would refer definitely to a spy gadget. But if I would say that there's a bug in the room and I have called an expert company to come and disinfect the bedroom, then you can see that we're talking about an insect. Because you would only disinfect for insects, but not for a spy gadget. So that's the way how you would try to work it out. So even when the word occurred in transparent context, sometimes we would be triggered to understand both of the things. When one word has two meanings, both of the meanings would come to our mind. So we would differentiate it by the sentences coming before it or after it. A second issue is whether all interpretations of an ambiguous word are treated equally. Compare, for example, a balanced homonym such as right, where both words are highly frequent. Now, I could always be saying, again, this word right, it can be used for two meanings. Right and wrong in that sense. Right, matlab sahi hona. Right, matlab seedhe haath. So there are two different meanings once again. So if I would say, I need you to turn to the right, that means that I'm not telling you to choose from wrong or good or bad, but I'm telling you to turn yourself towards the angle right side. So once again, you can try to understand the context through the sentence. So where both words are highly frequent with the polarized one, such as scale. Now, where the dominant sense refers to a set of numbers, but a secondary one refers to a characteristic of a fish. Scale, once again, you see, it's another word with it's a polarized word. It has the dominant sense would refer, if we say that I want you to measure a scale, then once again your point would go that it's a set of numbers that I'm referring to. But we need to remove the scales. A fish has scales. The shiny part that a fish has on the skin, that is called a scale also. So differentiating between those is sometimes a little difficult. Now, experiments have examined how readers process sentences where polarized homonyms are used in their secondary senses. So they indicate that reading slows down even when there is a disambiguating context. Even then, sometimes we do slow down. We would ponder on what does it exactly mean before we go ahead. So this suggests that multiple meanings of words are activated in parallel with priority given to the dominant one. So immediately when we talk about scale, I would think about two things. The set of numbers, a scale of how to measure, or I would then secondly I would refer to a fish scale. So my most first I have both of these parallel side by side, but the dominant one would be a set of numbers. So first I would search for that in the sentence if it's referring to that, and then fall back to the other. So sometimes it suggests that when you have multiple meanings of words, sometimes the priority is given to the dominant side. So ambiguity. Now, ambiguity syntactic, structural. Now, syntactic ambiguity falls into two types. Local ambiguity, where the word class or syntactic function of a word is unclear at the moment the word occurs, but is made clear by subsequent context. So sometimes local ambiguity, where the word class or the syntactic function, the structural function of a word is unclear sometimes, but when the word is coming to you or when the word occurs, but is made clear by subsequent context. Like that means by the sentence. So sometimes if I just say the single word, it wouldn't be clear, but it can be made clear sometimes with the complete sentence. Like I told you, if you don't understand the meaning of a word, you need to read the whole sentence or the sentences coming before it or right after it. So examples, slash indicates point of ambiguity. Now the horse raced past the barn, slash fell. So when the horse was racing past the barn, he also fell. John remembered the answer, slash was in the book. So it indicates a point of ambiguity. The slash would indicate that. But once again, the sentence can explain it. So standing ambiguity, where a sentence remains ambiguous even after it is complete. Sometimes even after the sentence is complete, you can't understand the meaning. Like when I said before that there is a bug in the room. Now, I've said the whole sentence, you see, but it's still not clear. What do I mean? There is a bug in my room. The listener can't comprehend what am I talking about. Am I talking about a spy gadget or am I talking about an insect? Until I complete the sentence. So sometimes sentences do remain ambiguous even after they're complete. By just saying, if I would just end the sentence at that there's a bug in my room, nobody can understand that, so it would remain ambiguous, even though I've completed the sentence. But then I need to relate to it to make the meaning more clear. So either relate to it being an insect or relate to a spy gadget. So in, for example, Bond saw the spy with the telescope. The telescope, you know, James Bond is a famous spy character the British have invented. And there are so many movies related to James Bond, the 007. So he saw the spy with the telescope. Now, James Bond himself is a spy, you see. Now, this sentence doesn't clearly explain that was Bond carrying the spy, the telescope, or the spy was carrying the telescope. You see, because when we suddenly hear this, Bond saw the spy with the telescope. So if we know the background of James Bond being a spy for the British intelligence, then we would immediately refer to that. So that would be the most obvious meaning that we would turn to. That Bond being the spy, he saw the other spy through the telescope. Or that he saw a spy using a telescope. So the telescope might be carried by either Bond or the spy, and the ambiguity can only be resolved by the wider context. So the wider context would be when we further explain that, further explain a sentence. Now, local ambiguity provides insights into syntactic parsing because it enables the researchers to investigate how a subject reacts both at the point where the ambiguity occurs and at the point where disambiguation occurs. So local ambiguity would provide insights, so with syntactic parsing, because the researchers, when it enables the researchers to investigate how a subject reacts at both the points, from the starting point and at the end point, where the ambiguity occurs, and at what point does it become disambiguation starts. So at both points the researchers would study that. The reactions of a reader now can be monitored by tracking eye movements or by presenting sentences word by word and noting when a processing difficulty causes a delay in moving on to the next word. So sometimes you can monitor the readers by tracking how they're reading in the book, how fast their eyeballs are moving, or giving them how much difficulty they would have in moving from one word to the next word. So in principle, the language user could react to ambiguity in several ways. So language user can react in several ways. number 1A would be adopt a single analysis, even at the risk of later having to abandon it. That's a garden path view. He would take a single analysis, a single dominant meaning, and go with that, and then when you read the next sentence, then you would say, oh, that doesn't mean that, and then abandoning that thought and saying, okay, now this means this. So that would be one way. Like, for example, with the same sentence, I would repeat again that there's a bug in my room. Maybe I would immediately say, okay, there's a bug, an insect, because that's more commonly used. So later on, if I study ahead, in the next sentence it would say that I had experts remove it from my telephone. So then I would abandon the thought that it's an insect and come to the spy gadget thought. So that would be a garden path view. B, the other alternative would be hold alternative analysis in parallel, keep them both on side, a spy gadget and an insect, but provisionally make use of one that best fits the context and add it to the meaning representation. So read the whole sentence, read the whole context that it's written in, read a sentence that's coming before it and after it, and then I would have both meanings in my mind. I would hold the alternative analysis both in mind when reading that sentence, but I would then see according to the context which one fits better and then apply that. So C, another alternative would be hold alternative analysis in parallel, where they compete with each other until one becomes so highly activated on the basis of new evidence that it is accepted. It's a constraint-based approach. So this would be that I would stick with that thing that's an instinct until I keep on reading the whole paragraph and I can completely, surely distinguish that no, we're not talking about an insect, we're talking about a spy gadget. So that would be a constraint-based approach. Another would be delay commitment until the ambiguity is resolved. So don't even try to judge what the meaning is, and just delay that thought until you read further on and then resolve the meaning of a word. So that's usually how I would go about. If I find a word that is difficult and can't understand, I would just read on in the context and try to understand what it means, or listen to the context. So evidence suggests that one preferred interpretation is chosen and revised later if necessary. So evidence does suggest that one way of interpreting it or translating it is chosen and revised later if it's necessary for us. Now, eye movement experiments show that readers experience processing difficulty not so much at the point where an ambiguity rises, but at the point where disambiguation occurs. So if we just experiment with the eye movement, maybe where an ambiguity is, the reader won't find it difficult. But where at the point it shows disambiguation, at that point maybe the eye movement will show that we're going back to the same word. So those experiments could relay that. Now this might appear to support a single analysis view, but might equally reflect processes B or C also. So an important issue is how the preferred interpretation is chosen, how we choose to interpret it. So early discussion focused on syntactic considerations. Also, when we see that how the words are structured, or the sentences are structured, that also is considered. It was suggested that the listener or reader / reader exercised a preference for a canonical subject-verb-object sentence structure. Hence, an initial assumption that the horse raced consists of subject, main verb. So the horse race, that consists, it's showing the horse as the subject, and raced, they're showing it as the verb, the action that the horse performed. So it consists of the subject and the main verb. So the horse would be the subject and raced would be the main verb in it. So sometimes subject, verb, and then the object also would show preference. A more sophisticated theory proposed two strategies that are specifically syntactic. So when they were researching this, so they came out with a more sophisticated theory, and that showed us two strategies. Now, two strategies were minimal attachment was one, minimal attachment, and the second one was late closure. So minimal attachment, what does minimal attachment do? Minimal attachment can build the simplest structure consistent with the rules of grammar. So syntactically, when we are trying to understand something, it would build a simplest structure using the simple form of grammar. Late closure, now that's the other strategy, where there is a problem of attachment. Ambiguity makes an attachment to the clause that is currently being processed. Ideally, assume that the current clause is the main one. So there is a problem of attachment ambiguity, and sometimes it can make an attachment to the clause that is currently being processed. Ideally, assume that the current clause is the main one. So you would ideally assume that the current clause would be the main clause. Now, later lexicalist accounts introduced a semantic element, suggesting that the preferred reading is based upon the argument structure of the current verb. So later on they did introduce a meaning element, semantic element, suggesting that maybe something that is reading would be based upon the argument that the whatever current verb we are using, according to that. Now, for example, the pattern associated with donate involves a donator and a recipient. So just the pattern of the word donate, that involves two people. When I'm going to donate something, then one is going to be the donator, that's going to be me, and then there is going to be a person I'm donating it to, or a company that I'm donating it to. So there has to be a recipient. So the preferred interpretation of the man donated would thus be that the agent, that's the person who's the donator, and past simple verb. So past simple verb would be that donated. Man would be the agent, past simple verb, donated. But animacy also plays a part. So a check cannot be an agent. So the preferred interpretation of the check donated would be object donated with past participle. So a check, if we say that a man donated a check, so in that a man would be the agent using the past simple verb donated. Then moving on, now a check, the word a check, the man donated a check. A check cannot be an agent. It can't be an agent. So the preferred interpretation for this would be that the check donated would be object, that it's the object that was being donated. So object donated with past participle. A third explanation is entirely semantic. Now, the preferred continuation of the lawyer examined would be the witness rather than by the judge. So the preferred continuation of this sentence, that the lawyer examined. Now, this could be the witness rather than by the judge, simply because world knowledge tells us that lawyers tend to examine rather than be examined. Because it's just simple knowledge that lawyers examine different cases, but they themselves are not being examined. So that would help us understand it. So the lawyer examined. Now, this is thus some disagreement as to whether we attempt to resolve ambiguity using purely syntactic criteria, or whether lexicosyntactic or semantic criteria play a part. So that's something where there is a disagreement. So a criticism of some of the ambiguity data is that it is not based upon a natural parsing situation. Garden path sentences are often presented to subjects without any preceding context. So a criticism of it would be that some of the ambiguity data is that it's not based on the natural parsing situation and would fall under the view of garden path sentences. So garden path sentences are often presented to subjects without any preceding context, like they don't even give anything ahead of it. They would just be given a simple part of the sentence. Now, it is therefore not clear at this point context might normally have enabled the reader to resolve the kind of ambiguity that has been studied or not. So for example, the preferred interpretation of the horse raced past the barn might be influenced by the preceding sentences which ran, there were two horses. So maybe that would make a difference. A referential theory argues that contextual information will often ensure disambiguation. So garden path ambiguity. Garden path ambiguity is more easily exemplified in written text than in spoken, though it is sometimes dependent upon the omission of normal punctuation. So in previous lectures we did discuss about what garden path view is, so please refer to that and you'll understand it. So garden path ambiguity would say that it's more exemplified, it's more found in written text than in the spoken language, and sometimes it's dependent upon how we remove punctuations. So in speech, prosody provides important cues, intonation, pausing, shifts in pitch level, variation in articulation rate, which often serve to resolve attachment ambiguity by indicating where clauses begin and end. Now, when we go ahead and study analogy model, now an analogy model would be a theory Glushko presented in 1979 that English readers attribute pronunciations to unknown words by tracing analogies with known ones. So what do? They would pronounce a word when they're in their mind, they're tracing it, different analogies, and seeing the similarities. Now this is because the opaque nature of English spelling system means that many words cannot be identified by using simple graphophone correspondence like the GPC rules. So the graphophone rules would be that sometimes maybe we cannot simply just understand a word by just the word itself, but until we see the context of it. So pronouncing, maybe we do relate it to different things. The most important area in monosyllabic word appears to be the rhyme, how we rhyme words. The vowel plus final consonant is S. So evidence for an analogy effect comes from experiments where readers find it harder to pronounce a non-word such as wint, which has neighbors of varying pronunciations, pint and mint. So it wouldn't, they would maybe find it harder to pronounce that, so they have conducted experiments that come to effect on readers that a non-word such as wint, which has no meaning to it whatsoever, would be very similar to the pronunciations of pint and mint. So in analogy models, we would say that the most important area in a monosyllabic word appears to be the rhyme, the vowel plus final consonants, which is an S. Now, evidence for an analogy effect comes from experiments where readers find it harder to pronounce a non-word such as wint. Now, wint is not a common word that anybody wouldn't pronounce. So that's why if that is something, a non-word, which has no meaning, but it rhymes with pint, pint means a quarter, or mint, the mint flavor. So sometimes it would be difficult for the person in the experiment to pronounce that wind. So then one such as Tade, whose neighbors all rhyme fade, made, wade. So Tade would be easier to pronounce because it has more words related to it, like fade, it faded from view, we made something, wade through a puddle of water. So those Tade would maybe be easier to explain or to memorize or to pronounce properly. So analogy is an important strategy in early reading. However, the extent to which young readers make use of it as against whole word matches appears to vary between individuals and may partly reflect the method of instruction. So sometimes, even though analogy is an important strategy, still in early reading we would say that, however, the extent to which the younger readers would start reading and making use of it would go against the whole word matches. So it appears to vary, has a difference between the individuals, and may partly reflect the method of instruction, what method was used. So furthermore, analogy cannot represent a complete alternative to GPC rules. So it's not a completely, can't be an alternative for that. So many multisyllabic words do not have neighbors. So some of the words, they don't have neighbors, that we could like say that yes, so pronunciation would be easy. And there are many monosyllabic non-words such as Jove, whose pronunciation is easy to infer, but which cannot be matched to similar words. So Jove, it's very difficult to match that with a different rhyming word that makes sense. So the analogy model has therefore been expanded to include parts of words. The pronunciation of Jove might be determined by its resemblance to groove. So, but still, you see, Jove and groove, they resemble a little bit, but still it's pronounced in a different way. Jove would be different and groove would give a different sound. So we can't say that it has the same analogy and the pronunciation would be easy, that if we know the pronunciation of groove, then we can easily pronounce the word Jove also. It's not possible. So the analysis would be that when a child is in the process of developing its first language, or an adult is learning a foreign language naturalistically, much of the linguistic information that is acquired is unanalyzed. So when a child is in the process, when he's trying to learn a language, a first language, or an adult at our age, if we want to learn a foreign language, let's say for anything, if I want to learn, for you, if you want to learn English, if I want to learn French or Japanese or Chinese, naturally, then much of the linguistic information is that is acquired would be unanalyzed. So unanalyzed knowledge includes chunks of language, formulaic expressions and phonological sequences which have been picked up by the listener but have not been disconstructed into their constituent parts. So something that they've picked up, the listener has picked up, but they haven't disconstructed it in their constituent parts or separated it. It's just like in chunks we're picking up the words and we're learning them. So somebody teaches us, let's say, a word, I want to learn a word in Russian, I would say that kakjila. Now what I did is, if I don't know that language, or if you don't know the language, you'd repeat that, kakjila. So what you would do is, the meaning of that word means, how are you? Kakjila. That is a full chunk. Now what you're going to do is, you're going to memorize it as a chunk, as a whole chunk. You're not going to separate what kak means, what jila means. What you're going to do is take it as a chunk, and as an unanalyzed knowledge, you're going to immediately pick that as kak jila, a full complete word. So in time, the constituents of these chunks are identified. Later on, when you start learning the language, then those are identified. And the child or language learner progresses towards more analyzed forms of knowledge. So sometimes then the language learner would progress towards more analyzed forms of knowledge. Analyzed knowledge is more capable of being expressed, that is, more explicit. So operating in conjunction with analysis is a second parameter control. This refers to the extent to which a language learner has to apply attention when using the target language. So the degree of analysis and control exercised by the learner may be affected by the language task in hand. So the degree of analysis, we would say, and control exercised by the learner may be affected by the language that is a task in hand. So anaphor resolution. Now what is anaphor resolution? Now an anaphor is a piece of language which refers back to a previously mentioned entity, action or idea. It's a piece of language that would refer to something that has happened before, some action that has been performed before, some idea that has been performed before, or some word that we've mentioned before. So examples are personal or demonstrative pronouns. Example of an anaphor would be she and that. Proverbs, did so. Adverbs, there, and expressions like the latter. So it would be like, you can say that they can be personal or they can be demonstrative. They can either show your action, or they can be personal, like she, or that happened like this, she did that. Or proverbs that did so, that would be a proverb, also an anaphor. Or in an adverb, there would be an anaphor. And anaphor resolution is the process that occurs when a listener or reader interprets an anaphor by linking it to its antecedent. So what a person does is, a listener or a reader, he interprets an anaphor, like she, that, did so, there, and by interpreting the anaphor, they link it to the antecedent. Now, anaphor resolution appears to be an automative online process, but one that can slow down reading, especially where there is uncertainty as to what the antecedent is. So sometimes an anaphor resolution appears to be an automated online process. It's something that automatically happens with us, and we can just automatically fall towards that, and it can slow down our reading process. So when we're reading something, if we try to use the anaphoric resolution in it, then our reading process would slow down. So especially where there is uncertainty as to what the antecedent is exactly. So experiments using ambiguous anaphors provide insights into how an antecedent is chosen. So when you're using experiments using ambiguous anaphors, then that would provide maybe an insight or a view to it of how an antecedent would be chosen for that. Now, the factors that are included in this. First factor would be parallel position. Now, what is a parallel position? A pronoun in subject position is taken to refer to an antecedent that is in subject position. A pronoun in subject position, pronoun used that is in the place of where a subject should be, is taken to refer to an antecedent that is in the subject position. So an antecedent, we would take the pronoun to refer to the antecedent. For example, John phoned Bill. He said he was ill. You see, you take the pronoun and do it with the antecedent. So John phoned Bill. We removed John and said he was ill. Again, instead of Bill, putting John and Bill, like John said Bill was ill, instead of saying that, we would say that he said he was ill, joining it. Now, this other point would be current topic. Now, the current topic, a pronoun is taken to refer to a topic that has been thematicized in the preceding sentence or is in current focus. So, for example, as for children, they don't like them. maybe they frighten. Once again, a pronoun taken from it and then thematicized in the preceding sentence would be that as for children, they don't like them. So they're talking about children as the subject, they don't like them. Maybe they frighten them. So when we said maybe they frighten them, then obviously we are referring to the same subject, children. So proximity also matters, and the factors that are involved is a pronoun is taken to refer back to the most recent noun phrase. So we take a pronoun and we take it to refer back to a most recent noun phrase used. For example, he held some bread over the fire with a fork. It grew hot. So what we're doing is we're taking a pronoun, he, and held some bread over the fire with a fork. It grew hot. So we're replacing that. Now sometimes these criteria, for example parallel position and proximity, may be in conflict. So further factors appear to be word knowledge, animacy, and the thematic roles associated with the verb. The first of these accounts for the different resolutions of they are in would be that if further factors, if you would say that appear in the world knowledge, whatever knowledge you've gained from the world, the animacy and thematic roles associated with the verb, that's what you gain. So some criteria would be about how close they are put to the subject, how close the verb is placed to, or if they are in parallel position. They might have a conflict, they might conflict with each other. Now the first of these accounts for the different resolutions of they are in, that they bought the apples because they were cheap. They bought the apples because they were cheap. The second would be they bought the apples because they were hungry. You see? Now there were two different ways that you can explain the same thing. They bought the apples because they were cheap. उन्होंने apples इसलिए खरीदे क्योंकि सस्ते थे. And they bought the apples because they were hungry. Or हम इसको different effect देने के लिए we can say that उन्होंने apples खरीदे क्योंकि उन्हें भूख लगी थी. So it's either in parallel position or in the proximity of how we use the words to change the context of a sentence. Now there has been much discussion of the kind of representation that an anaphor accesses. So this is especially an issue in listening, where there is no opportunity to look back to check understanding. So most of the time in reading we can always check back and see if we've read something wrong and what did it exactly mean. But when you're listening to something, then it's very difficult. Either you ask the person to keep repeating the things that he said, but still it's very difficult to hear something and then trying to comprehend it. So there's been much discussion of this kind about the anaphor accesses. So especially in the issue in listening, where, like said, there is hardly any opportunity to look back to check the understanding of what is being said. So the listener has to carry forward a mental representation in which current topics are marked as likely subjects for anaphoric reference. So sometimes the listener has to carry forward a mental representation in which current topics are marked, which are likely to be subjects for anaphoric reference. So one account represents items in the current mental representation as activated to various degrees. So thus enabling an anaphoric link to be made to the most salient. So those who include definite nouns within the class of anaphors point out that definiteness entails two different retrieval processes. With some noun phrases, the antecedent will be in explicit focus. You can see below where it says that Erica unlocked the door with difficulty, the door tended to stick. So with some noun phrases, the antecedent would be in explicit focus, like in C, while with others it will not be. Like in D, Erica unlocked the door with difficulty, the key tended to stick. So unlock the door with difficulty, the door tended to stick or the key tended to stick. You see, in the first one the antecedent is in explicit focus, you can understand it, that it is in explicit focus. In the second one the key tended to stick, that is not in explicit focus. So the antecedent, it isn't clear there. So anyway, students, I think that would be enough for today's lecture. We are going to continue our next lecture exactly from here, talking about anaphors and how antecedents are used, and how we use anaphors in sentences, and how our mental process is of retrieval of words, and how we try to focus on a sentence and distinguishing the meaning of that. So at the moment we will stop right at this point. I would like you to keep this in mind for the next lecture, so we are clear about what we're going to be studying in the next one. So thank you so much and good day.